Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, divine friend, Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune ourselves to the presence of Christ, that through this music we may experience devotion, courage, redemption, and eternal freedom in thy divine light. We are thy children. Awaken us to our true nature of oneness in thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's just meditate together for just a couple of minutes and then we'll start. Almost all of you have done this before, but not everyone. So I'll give you an idea of how the day progresses. We're together for 4 hours, and during that time we divide our time between 3 activities. One is my talking about the story of Christ, the music that we're singing, sort of what the reason is why we're singing this and what the deeper meaning is. I usually talk for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. Then we sing for about an equal period of time, a section of the Oratorio. I believe we do it in 3 parts, if I'm not mistaken. No, more than that. 4 parts, 4 sections, whatever it is, that's what we do. And the last section is a little longer. And we sing all the songs, the choir songs, the solos, everything. And everybody sings everything. We cluster a few of the more confident singers around the mic so that there's a very strong dominant sound of what it's supposed to sound like, so all the rest of us can just let loose and nobody can hear us. Okay? And believe me, it's really satisfying to do that. You don't have to, this is not a performance on any level. My speaking is being recorded because it has a lasting interest, because it's about both the Oratorio and about Jesus, but the singing is just for us. And everybody in the room is doing the same thing. There's no audience. We'll sit like this when I talk, and then after the singing, immediately after each singing section, we meditate for about 15 minutes. When we sing, we're all going to move up onto the altar because the acoustics are better. We're closer to the altar. It's a place of worship. Here is the place where the congregation sits and watches, but there is where the priests are. So we all become priests. And the closer we are together, the better it works. There's this weird American inclination to want to be able at all times to go like this and not touch anyone. Regardless of whether that's healthy in any circumstance, it doesn't work when we're doing a group sing, because then you only have your own voice and you lose the very power of being together. So I would like to have caution, crime scene, you can't pass over, and make a very small little group up there. So I will try to herd you continuously. At a certain point I will become annoyed and I will stop doing it. But for your sakes, I encourage you. If you're not comfortable standing, we have a few chairs. You can push the chair right into the center of the crowd. Maybe someone could help move Sarah's chair each time so she'll be more comfortable. Okay? And so we put a few chairs. We can take more if we need them. If you need help up the stairs, that's what this banister is for. The stairway to heaven over here. Todd has kindly agreed to play for us. Each of the songs that are short, the recitatives, which are not very long, I think they're too short even in performance, but they're impossibly too short when we're singing them, because it takes at least one time through to kind of get the drift. So we do all of them twice. So just be ready for that, because usually the first time through you're kind of getting a feeling for it, and the second time you can really give your heart to it. Every so often, between every section we take a little break. So if you need water or to use the restrooms or anything like that, you'll have your moment. Other than that, this is really totally just for fun, and it's fun in the divine sense. Swami once said that the entire purpose of Ananda was to have fun, and then he had to redefine the word fun so that we would understand. He said, fun for us is to feel close to Divine Mother and then to share that. And this music, as I'll now begin to speak about, is really one of the funnest things that we do. I mean, listening to it is powerful, but having it run through your own body, which is a privilege reserved for those who either have the time or the talent or the combination of those things to be part of the choir or the singing group. Many of us lack one or the other, and therefore we just don't get to do it enough. I was reading recently, most of you know I've been working on this book about Swami Kriyananda. I'm in the last phases of work on it. And so I've found many of these gems that Swamiji has stated. And he was talking at one point about the music. It was very interesting how he wrote it. He said, first of all, I wrote this music to be for a community. He said, many composers write music for the glory of the music, or sometimes even worse, to show what they're capable of doing. And then sometimes a composer will compose for a particular vocalist who may want a showpiece or something to show off their unique talents or their extraordinary range or their dramatic ability. And so all of those narrow the possibility. I mean, ordinary classical music is sometimes quite difficult to sing, and people have to be at a very skilled level to be able to do it. But Swamiji's whole idea of all the music he wrote, not just the oratorio, but all of it, was that he was writing for a community, which is, he wanted that music, he wanted everyone in the community to be able to just pick up the music and sing it without any particular training or unique ability. It's really quite remarkable that he was able to write music that's so deep and at the same time so simple. And he also spoke a lot about, at different times, I want to finish this first thought. And then Swamiji, late in his life, and now I don't remember where this paragraph appeared, in which book he wrote it or in what context, but he made the statement after all these years. He said, just objectively, he has observed that those people who have consistently sung this music, he said, they've been transformed. He said, without virtually a single exception, he says, the people who have devoted themselves to singing this music, they have been personally changed by the music. Swami's not one to put himself forward. So it was a very interesting statement. I'm going to talk in a moment more about why that is. And so then he actually wrote, I plead with you, he said, to sing this music. It's very interesting. I mean, we struggle so hard at Kriya and meditation and controlling our emotions, and the list is long. We all know the list, and let's not list it, okay? But he said, if you just sing this music, you'll be transformed. Now we have to understand that all of creation is made from Om. And Om is a vibration. As Swamiji said most interestingly, Om is a vibration, is the vibration of the universe. Vibration meaning movement. The power beyond creation is absolutely still, and then there is movement. The Lord said, let there be light, or in the beginning was the word, which is sound. But Om is a vibration, and it is the substance of creation. And that Om, once it begins to vibrate, it manifests as sound, and it manifests as light. And both light and sound are the vibration of Om, which is to say, it is the substance of creation itself, and it is the step from the manifested world into the unmanifested. In other words, it brings us closer to God. And all words, all sound, all music emanates from the Om, and it just depends how far away it gets from the source. But it all has to be Om because that's what sound is. In the beginning was the word. And Swamiji comments that, explains that melody in music is the soul's aspiration, is aspiration. And he says it's so interesting nowadays that music, as it is popularly presented today, if you listen, it has almost no melody. You know, really modern music, really popular music. You hear popular songs. I was listening to an interview on the radio, and they were illustrating it with some popular song. It was actually about the water shortage in Cape Town, Africa, which was an interesting subject, and they talk about how they've published all these peppy, short songs, which are the length of your shower. Partly to be humorous and partly to be practical. You start the song and you need to finish your shower by the time the song is over. It's a 90-second shower. Okay? Yeah, so they're totally running out of water, but moving right along. So then they played one of these shower songs, and there was a lot of noise in the song, and the woman had an interesting accent, and it was an interesting song. And the song, it was like Swami's song Peace, where the melody is on one note, except it was not an uplifting result, but there was no melody. And very often you'll hear really popular songs. They'll go on one note for a while, then they'll go on another note for a while, and then they'll go up to a different note, and then they'll go back down to this note. But when you're finished, there's no melody. It's just sound. Because, Swami says, in our culture today, people aspire to nothing. So they have no melody. So the melody is the aspiration of where we're trying to go, that life is a journey with an actual purpose, instead of just time passed until we die. I mean, those of us in this room understand this. I mean, I know myself, my terror when I was younger, before I found the path, which, thank you God, was in my late teens, was that everybody seemed to think it was just a journey with no destination except death. And I just found that terrifying. And intuitively, I couldn't believe it was true, but it seemed to be true. But then I discovered God realization as the goal. So as soon as we understand that God realization is where we're heading, then everything that we do is measured against that aspiration. And everything that we do, we want it to feed into that aspiration. And there are so many studies these days about the power of music and how it affects you. Some of the most fascinating Alzheimer's patients who've been out of touch with reality even for years. If you play the music that was meaningful to them in their younger lives, they'll be able to sing the songs and remember the songs, and their whole demeanor and their relationship to the world will change, because melody and music is a different part of the brain. And it's a more, I don't know, I can't explain it physiologically, but it's a closer to the source part of our brain, which is why Master said that chanting, he called it chanting is half the battle. And what he meant by that was, in the battle against delusion, if you chant, then delusion is 50% reduced in power. Because what we are working with when we want to advance spiritually is we're trying to change our essential vibration. Because it's our vibration that determines our experience of life. Because all of creation is just the Om vibration in various distances from stillness, actually. And so the more we oscillate in the more agitated aspects of it, such as American politics right now, or modern music, or modern art, or, I mean, just the lists are extremely long, the news, whatever it is, it's a very agitating oscillation. You really can't look or listen to any of the news. Even Cape Town, South Africa running out of water which I found to be extremely interesting, it's still like, my, what is going to happen to the planet when all these enormous population centers built in deserts, which is where they all are, many of them are, what happens when they can't be sustained anymore? I mean, it's a very agitating vibration. God is love, God is peace. That's a very calming vibration. So the more we vibrate close to the Om, the more we are transformed, because that becomes our vibration. So when we sing this music and not merely listen to it, we're committing everything that we are. We're committing our breath, we're committing our attention, our intelligence, and even literally our physical form. And our physical form, it's not really here. It's just an energy pattern. Everything is just an energy pattern. I mean, it's so, we feel so fixed. But in fact, we are nothing but an energy pattern, which is where miracles happen from. Because anyone, whether us individually or some force coming into us, that changes that energy pattern, completely changes the manifestation. So Swamiji was so intelligently working with the methods. I was talking to, this morning, this gentleman, Salil, who's visiting us from India, who's helping a lot with our thinking about how Ananda promotes itself. He's a marketing expert. He's been a wonderful gift, and he's a very dear and devoted devotee. And he was talking about after spending 2 months in America and visiting almost all the Ananda centers here, already being very familiar with those in India, he talked about how community is the hardware. Our practices are the operating system, if I have these words right. And then he was trying to sort of understand what the apps are. And I suggested to him that the apps are all of Swami's books. And at first he thought I meant the physical book. I said, no, that's not what I mean. The apps are the subject of each of those books. Because literally that is what Swami did. He sat there and he thought, how else can we apply, these teachings? And creative art is one of them. And music is an extremely specific one. Given community, given the operating system of attunement to Master, how do we apply that? And Swamiji always said that music is the secret of what holds Ananda together. And he says music not only reflects consciousness, and this is the important part for us, it creates consciousness. So it isn't just a question of, this is our music because it represents Ananda. No, by singing this music, we become the consciousness that is Ananda. And that consciousness, the hardware is community, but the operating system is attunement to Master. And attunement to this whole path. And part of what this path has always been, as we talk about every week in the Festival of Light, Jesus appeared to the great Master Babaji. Now, we do that festival every week, and some of you, I believe, listen attentively, and some of you tune it out. I have to read the words, so I'm not in a position to tune it out, although every once in a while, one loses one's place and forgets where one is. But most of the time, I have to watch it word by word, which I consider the great blessing of the position that life has put me in, is that I'm not allowed ever to be inattentive to what we're doing. So I hear every week, Jesus appeared to the great Master Babaji. And every time I read that, a new kind of question comes to my mind. Where were they? Did they share a cup of tea? Did they talk? Was it merely intuitive? If Master was indeed Jesus in a previous incarnation, and Master's incarnation was the result of that, what was that conversation really like? I think it's time for me to reincarnate to rescue my teachings. Is that what Master said? Where did it all go? But the point being, there is this integral relationship between the Master who was Jesus and the life that we're living now. And even though people are inclined to think of our discipleship being to Yogananda, In fact, Master himself always spoke of the line of gurus, and that Master was the last in the line of gurus, but he saw it as an unbroken flow of energy. If you think Babaji Krishna there, and you think Master was Arjuna when Babaji was Krishna, if Master was in fact Jesus, if the three wise men, as Master said, were in fact Babaji, Lahiri, and Sri Yukteswar, where do you draw the lines? And our human mind is always wanting to personalize and apply the concepts of the ego to these things, but none of that really applies. We're dealing with an uplifting flow of magnetism that has been moving for a long time. Swamiji himself, toward the end of his life, he said this is speculation. He didn't know how to answer it himself. He said, if Master was Jesus, if Babaji was Krishna, and who knows how much farther back it goes, and Master was William the Conqueror and Ferdinand the Saint, Fernando the Saint in Spain, and you just have all these things. Swami said, I wonder if this line of gurus is responsible for this planet, he said. I wonder if different groups of masters are responsible for different planets. And he never drew that thought to a conclusion. He was just speculating. Isn't it interesting, historically, as far as we know, how much involvement there has been? And all of us who find ourselves drawn to this path, especially those who have had this lifelong commitment and whose primary flow of energy has been devotion to Master and working on both the hardware, the apps, and the operating system, all of us, dealing with this, that means that we too have been through this many times. In conversations with Yogananda, Master makes reference to two of the men who were monks with him then. Norman, who was a very big, strong man, Master referred to him as my giant, and he referred to what a good soldier he was when he was William the Conqueror and had to be at war all the time, that having a great, big, strong man like Norman with him was a really good thing. And then he spoke of this other man named Jerry Torgeson, who was a bit of a hothead, had a terrible temper, and eventually wasn't even able to stay at Mount Washington. But Master said about him, he was a good soldier. He fought hard for me. So you can see how in a monastery in Los Angeles, the qualities that were not serving Jerry very well, yet made him a great asset to Master when Master had a different incarnation to run through. In fact, one of the reasons that has been offered why Master would even take an incarnation like William, there's many reasons, is because he had disciples who needed that incarnation, who needed the opportunity to have that kind of courage, and, for example, might have great devotion like Jerry did, but had a temperament, that's not going to be able to work in an office. So he needed to be able to literally put his life on the line for his guru, and with great selfless and pure love, but in his own way. But all of this huge flow of energy is what we're really involved in, and integral to it because we are in the West, but more than just because we're in the West. It's just because it's this path. When Ananda first went to India, there was this question about the Festival of Light itself and the whole question of Jesus and the Bible and all of this. And there was a certain reluctance, which Swami himself, for various reasons, he didn't introduce the festival right away. He gave different explanations for not doing that to different people. One of them, he said recently, that I read recently, was he felt that India was very ritual-oriented, and he didn't want to start our work in India with a ritual. He wanted people first to understand what we were really about, and then when we introduced a ritual, it would be understood properly. But there was also this feeling that it was too much about Jesus. So I was mulling all these things over, never working in India, never being assigned to India, only visiting there, but curious. I said, Swamiji, all of us in the East have had to swallow a boatload of foreign teachings, a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't natural to us. If the West can expand to the East, shouldn't the East have to expand to the West in the same way? Swami's response was, of course. It has to be a two-way street. So the involvement of Jesus, rightly understood, because it's no better understood in the West, it's just more familiar, and in some ways that familiarity is more of an obstacle. So for all of us at Ananda, most of us, all the years that before Swami wrote the Oratorio, we always had Christmas, we always had Easter, but I don't know how to say it exactly. It was peripheral. We did it because we loved it, we were accustomed to it. I grew up Jewish, but most people were accustomed to it. And it was fun, and Swami loved Christmas and Easter. I mean, he himself had profound devotion to Jesus and knew how important it was. Much more importantly, Master celebrated those holidays with great devotion. If Master hadn't celebrated them, Swami wouldn't either, but Master did. Master honored those traditions. But we never exactly knew where to put it. Swamiji would talk and he would make it more about Sanatana Dharma, but we just didn't know where to put it. And then Swami went to Israel in 1985, I believe it was, and he wrote this Oratorio. And when he wrote this, it was like, oh, this is our vibration of understanding Jesus. Same story, same events, same saga, because that is the tale. But this vibration and these words, this is the story of Jesus as we understand it. And it was like, well, my Jewish mother, after the Oratorio came, my Jewish mother decided that we had become Christians. They sort of got mailings and kind of kept up with Ananda from a distance out of interest because I was involved in it. But she decided we had become Christians at this point. I disputed that with her and told her we'd always been Christians. I mean, I thought this would help to tell, like looking back on it, I think, what? Why did I do this? And you all may remember, I finally decided to just let her have the guilt because she started feeling really guilty for not raising me Jewish enough. And that's why this great betrayal of my heritage had taken place. No amount of reason solved the issue. So I just let her feel terrible about it. I mourned with her. We both agreed it was too late and it was just tragic. And that seemed to solve the whole thing. It never was an issue after that. But my mother was right, actually. My mother surprised me at many times in our lives because, as a rule, I didn't find her wisdom inspiring. I tended to go my own course. But I wrote her off a little too soon because many times she actually was just right on. She would just slip in some way and I would argue the details, but she had the essence because we did become Christians, because we understood the vibration of Jesus. Swamiji had created an app. He'd applied our attunement to Jesus. And there's a lot of power in that. It's really fundamental to our teaching to understand Jesus because that's the East and West coming together. And that's why this vibration is transforming. I mean, look at the power that Christ has had and continues to have over so many people. And this isn't just a nod of the head to Western spirituality. This is the fact of Jesus' vibration, which is extraordinary. And I'm sure if Master was Jesus, or if those three masters were involved and Jesus went back to India for 18 years, we don't know which side of the oceans we were on, but the chances of our having been part of this experience are very, very great. And therefore, it's not merely that now it's a good idea, but all of these things are buried in us. And these are the samskars we're trying to activate. These memories. Edgar Cayce, who did all these past life readings, and over many years, those who were devoted to him organized, thousands of readings that he did for people, and there's a whole library where you can look it up by subject. But quite a lot of people who came to see him, and he himself was devoted to Jesus, but that was incidental, had an experience with Jesus, an experience as small as you were on the roadside and he walked by. And then, but this is the part that's so powerful, Edgar Cayce would tell them that everything that has happened since has been defined by that contact. Now, if you think of it as vibration, as all of us trying to find the divine vibration, and there's one moment where the power of it comes into us, then that becomes our reference point. Last night when we were singing and the choir got up to sing I Live Without Fear, I hear Karen, going dee, 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 just hitting every note. And then the choir, very quiet, goes, and then when it's all tuned up, then everybody started and sang absolutely exquisitely. And Karen is experienced enough that she could hear where all those notes were, and she just pulled them out and said them. But the rest of the choir needed her to set the tone, or at least was helped by her setting the tone. So the great masters set the tone. They hum the Om as close to the source as it can be hummed. At the source there's nothing but silence, but just outside the source there's this hum. So the master hums it, and then we hear that note. And of course in choir rehearsal, sometimes Karen hums the note, and then the sections just set out in any old direction at all, and everything has to stop, and the note has to be hummed again. And that's our incarnation. We hear the note, we set out. I myself, not being a particularly good singer, I tend to shift and shift. I changed I remember I was singing with Ramurti, and he remarked, we were just humming along for a rehearsal for this little play we're doing, and a particular chant needed to go behind it, so I started just humming the chant, and Ramurti just turned and looked to me and told me that I just kept shifting the key. And I went, what? I didn't know that. The relationship of the notes was still right. I didn't realize that I was shifting, all over the place from my starting note. I just don't know enough. He could hear it immediately. Well, Jesus knows what we're all supposed to sound like. And it's not even as if he does anything but exist. But the very vibration of the master is in tune with the Om. There's a saying in India, one moment in the company of a saint will be your raft over the ocean of delusion. And it's more than sentimental, because once our soul hears that vibration, then on some level, everything else sounds out of tune after that. Even though it may take us a while, we may think that we're still singing it correctly, in other words, that we're still living in tune with that, but sooner or later the dissonance catches up with us. Either someone more experienced says to us, I don't think so, or else we just feel it. You know how it is? You just feel, ooh, something is wrong. I don't know what. And you begin to go in quest of whatever it is that's making you feel dissonant. We have whole incarnations like that, don't we? That's my childhood. I knew there had to be a note somewhere, and I couldn't hear anybody singing it, but I knew it had to be somewhere. And when I heard it finally, which was when Swami Kriyananda walked into the room, that's it. That's what I've been trying to sing all this time, but I couldn't find the note. So Jesus is always pulsing. Master said, the vibrations of a self-realized master exist forever. Isn't that something? Once that manifestation is started, it's always there. It's always a doorway to the infinite. And on our particular path, these masters are our doorway. There's other great masters, and they're all singing too, but they're singing songs for their children. Our masters are singing the songs that resonate for us, or resonate for this temple. If the commitment is personal, it's for you. If the commitment is being formed, it's for you to explore and to experience and to decide. So, the Oratorio, the first part of the Oratorio, which we're going to sing now, is what I call the call to action. Let me just find exactly where we are and what the songs are. I think it's divided up on yours, but it doesn't really matter whether it is or not. And first, we start with the song Children of God and a New Tomorrow, which is, these are huge, big songs, just asking us to wake up and get started. That's the first thing that has to happen. We're in the sleep of delusion. We're working on this little play based on Whispers from Eternity that Marcel put together. And without wanting to, this is a spoiler alert, is that what you say? It starts out with the devotees all covered in black and just being just sort of lumps of delusion like this. They just lie there, they're lumps of delusion until the power of Whispers comes and they begin to wake up, right? And that's really what we are. So this Oratorio starts, Children of God, wake up, now is the time. And It's huge energy. When we do it, when we perform it, it starts with a trumpet. It just couldn't be more powerful, because there has to be some moment when we shift. And whether or not that's a huge outward or just an inner moment, but there's a moment where the balance between attachment to the world and desire for the infinite shifts toward the infinite. And it only has to shift, an imperceptible width for it to tip. And then everything starts rolling toward the divine instead of rolling toward delusion. Then the second is, we have to have some, what I call the inner resolution. This is the Psalm of David, the wonders that man did carve out of stone and in the spirit. And this is, I've heard the call, now I'm going to do something about it. Because it doesn't matter, as Swami often says, how delicious the food is served at the restaurant next door. First, you have to be hungry. And second, you have to travel the distance between your home and that place. And the determination to seek God is not just maybe it would be nice. There has to be real power. So these three songs just have so much force in them and so much light in them. I've woken up and this is what I'm going to do. And then the third part of this is all about Divine Mother. It's God is truth, God is love, mother of wisdom, and then the story of Mary, the angel coming, Mary's resolution, and Christ coming to her, Mary and Elizabeth, Hail Mary. It's all about Mary. Now, of course, if we're going to tell the story of Jesus, his conception and his birth were a huge part of the story. It's just been beautifully expressed. But it's also symbolic. It was very interesting. The very first time we did this Oratorio All Sing, which was maybe as long as 20 years ago, I just sat down with the Oratorio and tried to understand it from a point of view like this, where I could speak about it. And I saw this section on Divine Mother, and I realized, even though it's literal in the story, it's really also what the devotee responds to. We respond. Swamiji called Divine Mother mercy, compassion, and kindness. He actually said that in the context of our Education for Life system. All the apps you see start overlapping after a while. Our Education for Life system, he said, is a way of introducing the idea of Divine Mother back into society. Now, Divine Mother is never mentioned in Education for Life, because Divine Mother is just a symbol of the feminine expression of the divine, which Swami called compassion, mercy, and kindness. And in the devotee's search for self-realization, now, you can be a religious person and conform to a code of behavior based on many elements of divine understanding. This is what I have to do. This is what God wants me to do. This is what I have to do so I won't be condemned to hell. This is the behavior that is necessary. Swamiji said the problem with saying, if you do this, you'll get to heaven, is that the human mind begins to think, well, how much can I get away with and still get to heaven? And thus, the Catholic Church has had to define it down to the nth degree because of that obvious question. Some sins are terrible sins, some are minor sins, some can be expiated here. But the real relationship with God we need is the relationship with Divine Mother. Compassion, meaning I'm understood. The casual phrase that people say, they're so in love with someone, then they say, he gets me, she gets me. What that means is she understands, he understands. He recognizes who I am. Compassion, that's what that comes from. Oh, I understand. I know what your heart really is. And then mercy. And mercy means, well, that wasn't the brightest move, but it's okay. And unless you feel that that's how God relates to you, you can't keep your resolution. You don't have the nerve. Because the first time we profoundly disappoint ourselves, we project that disappointment onto God. And we make ourselves crazy with an impossible perfection. But mercy doesn't say we never fail. It just says that God understands and forgives. because what can a mother do? Even the worst murderer has a mother. Everybody has a mother, a perfect mother. And then kindness. What are we looking for? I read recently one of those little clever aphorisms. In a world when you can be anything, be kind. Swami often used that word, kindness. That doesn't mean weakness. That doesn't mean tolerating that which shouldn't be tolerated. But kindness is something else. Mercy, compassion, and kindness. And so we start with the Divine Mother. So I think now we should sing. So we have lyrics over here. Most of you know this. Those of you who don't, you'll get the feeling of it quickly enough. Let's all crowd up onto the altar, and let's do it. The power of music which we've all just experienced. Whenever I would travel, before I lived here, I did this same gig as a traveling show. But I would never travel anywhere without someone who could sing Swamiji's music. It just seemed foolish to me, because otherwise I would have to work 100 times as hard. Whereas if somebody could just get up and sing for a few minutes, then everything would be in order and whatever I would say would make more sense. Otherwise, I could talk for an hour and they could sing for 4 minutes and we'd all get to the same place. Master makes an interesting comment about marriage, saying that people are sitting together and romantic music is played and it arouses all this longing in their heart, and they imagine that whoever's sitting next to them is actually what's created it. And only much later, it was a very cynical remark by Master, only much later do they realize it was just the romantic music. It was not really the person who happened to be sitting next to them. But it's from the positive side, and this is what all of Swami's music is about, is that it enormously stirs the feelings, but it doesn't draw you out of yourself. You know, a great deal of beautiful popular music can stir your feelings, but in the end, it doesn't take you more deeply inward. It pulls you out of yourself. And so then one begins to look around for the way that can be fulfilled, or else all that energy is brought forward, and then it inevitably goes down because there's nothing actually to sustain it. So the power of Swami's music is that it stirs all that feelings, but it lifts it up to the spiritual eye, which is why if we meditate immediately afterwards, it becomes so much deeper. You know, much of the meaning that Swamiji put into the words that he wrote was intuitive on his part. He was always intuitive, not intellectual in his creativity. Usually, melody would come first. He did say, in this case, when he had to write the recitatives and he had to tell the story through the Bible, he had to find the words first. But he said it was an exception to his musical creative method, because the melody would speak to him first, and then he would have to try to understand in words what that melody meant. Again, it would come to him intuitively. It wouldn't be like he would reason it out. It's like the melody is a different part of the brain and it's closer to the Om. And then you put this, because words are a symbol, melody is direct. You don't have to speak the same language. Everybody will hear and feel the same thing in melody. Once when, a number of years ago, when there was a choir tour, the Oratorio tour, a tour of the Oratorio through Europe, through Italy. And a lot of Americans were on that trip, and we sang mostly in English, perhaps entirely in English. And people who listened didn't always understand the words at all. And one man who actually spoke French, so he didn't really get any of the words, because what wasn't in English was in Italian. But he said somehow he understood everything, because it communicated vibrationally first. Now there was a point to that. Oh, I was just remembering when Swami wrote that song, Jenny Will Love Me, which is kind of a joke, because the man sings this beautiful song about how Jenny will love him, and he has all these reasons why she will, and you can feel underneath it that he doesn't have a chance. She's going to marry somebody else, and it's an absolute certainty. And I said to Swamiji that's because he recorded it on an album. I said, the problem with that song is that any man who could write such a beautiful song and sing it so sweetly, Jenny would have to be an absolute idiot not to want to marry him. And if she was such an idiot, such a man would not be enamored of her. And Swami himself said he saw that as a problem too. But he said the melody came first. And then when the words came, he said, I was surprised, was how he put it, but those were the words that the melody was speaking of. So there's a different reality to what we're doing. And so when we sing, again, and I know I've said this before, but when we sing these songs, we're going to the place where they came from. I sat in the room when Swamiji was sitting next to the pianist Mukti at Ananda Village, who's very highly trained as a classical pianist and often plays for the events there. And Swami wanted to help her play the sonata in a certain way. And he sat next to her and he kept correcting her. And she never actually said it out loud, but he could feel her saying, but that's not how it's written. And he would say, I wrote it as close as I could. And he said, and I don't mean to be picky, he said, but this is how I heard it. It sounded more like this. Of course, we all also have to bring our own consciousness to these things. Swami was sometimes very particular, often very particular, and often at other times, if a person was completely sincere in their interpretation, he wouldn't correct them. So it was an interesting balance, but he wanted her to get it exactly. So when I, at least, am singing some of these songs, there's just something else moves in. Now, the part we come to now is we have the next songs come in 3 parts, and the first part is simply the birth of Jesus. And what we have to understand about the birth of any of these masters is that all of us are compelled by something unfinished. Swamiji says that what drives us to reincarnation is longing or regret. And if we think about our lives and we think about what disturbs the peace of our hearts, because the mind is disturbed after the heart is disturbed, it's because we long for something that was unfulfilled, or something happened that we feel uneasy about, and we so wish that we could make it better. I mean, that's the curse of our life experience, is this inability to be content in the present because of longing and regret. Swamiji says when we meditate, we talk about calming the mind, but it's not actually the mind that needs calming, it's the heart. Because the mind follows the agitation of the heart. When the heart is at peace, the mind is perfectly calm. When in my early years at Ananda in the early 70s, I was often with Swamiji in the evenings, usually with Seva, sometimes also with Kalyani, but usually just Seva and me. And we would often cook dinner and then sometimes stay a little bit through the evening. These were the very early years. And I remember one evening, Swami was sitting facing this way, talking to Seva, and I was behind, like this, out of sight. I put this into my book. And for some reason, some bhav had come over me, and whereas I was usually extremely mentally active and restless and agitated in 100 ways, this state of just complete calmness came over me. And Swamiji was talking to Seva. Actually, he was meditating a little. He had his eyes closed. And then he said, Asha, are you still in the room? And I said, yes, sir. He said, why can't I feel you? And I said, because my mind is unusually calm. And he said, oh, yes, there you are. Just like that, without ever turning around. And of course, my mind was unusually calm because it was not agitated in that particular moment by all the longings and all the regrets, which is what usually moves us. Now, we reincarnate because these things compel us, and the longings can be quite positive. We had a wonderful marriage, we had wonderful children, We had a wonderful artistic life. We were creative scientists. We love mathematics. We want to be a medical doctor. I mean, it's not, these longings are not selfish necessarily. We simply long to help people. That will bring us back again and again. We've discovered a great deal and we want to give back. But there's something that we need. So we're in the astral world, and the astral world is beautiful, and then suddenly these vrittis in the spine make us restless. And I think before we know it, there we are in a womb. And it's sort of like, how did I get here? We're not really sure, but the vibration shifted and then we're there again. But a master has no longing and no regret and lives only in the superconscious moment. So what draws a master into this world is the needs of disciples, the need of the planet, of civilization, whatever it might be, a commitment on their part, which they call a desireless desire, which is simply a closer proximity to radiate the light, but also the needs of the disciples. It's a very complicated and exquisitely beautiful story. Master says, I will come again and again, 1 trillion times if necessary. You know, crossing a million crags of suffering on bleeding feet. I mean, it's quite a statement he makes, as long as one stray brother is left behind. So in some unfathomable state of freedom, a master feels us, literally, and feels that it's an unfinished job, that our desire for freedom has to be fulfilled, and that obligation has been assumed by this guru. And so Swamiji puts that into the Festival of Light. A prayer of love, well, first he says, goes up, from the hearts of mankind, of creatures everywhere, and for the hearts of mankind, goes up in wordless yearning, a prayer for redemption. Even that phrase, wordless yearning, because it's beyond our intellect. It's not really what we think. It's this just longing of the heart to be freed of all this restlessness, to come to peace finally, and to have all those disappointments and sorrows fulfilled, which is part of the lyrics of these songs. But a prayer of love, so first goes up in wordless yearning, this prayer for redemption, to be redeemed from our own ignorance, to be saved from our own catastrophes. And the catastrophes are catastrophes of fulfillment as much as disappointment. Don't think it's all suffering. It's getting everything we want, and then still realizing that even holding in our hands the fruit of every desire, there's still a wordless yearning that isn't satisfied until that infinity is obtained. And so a prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. We say this every week because it's profoundly important that we get our consciousness focused on what's really happening here. A prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. A ray of your light flashed out from the heart of infinity. It's just a poetic way of saying what can't be expressed in words. Burst downward through night skies of consciousness, that's us, night skies of consciousness, to be born on earth for the redemption of mankind, because this wordless yearning had gone forward for the redemption of mankind in human form. And I was explaining in some other context, we are all imprisoned by our karma. And so we live behind stone walls and locked gates of our own karma. And the Master willingly goes behind those stone walls and locked gates and shows us how to come out. But he goes all the way into human form. So when one of these masters come, see now what happens when I was singing, when we were all singing just a few minutes ago, for a few minutes Karen stood next to me. And of course I could hear her voice right in my right ear, and I could hear all the people on the microphone in my left ear, and it was pretty hard not to know what the note was supposed to be. I mean, I managed not to know sometimes, but it was very hard not to know because it was pouring in from both sides. Now, a master always is radiating. It's like a lighthouse in the fog. And how close we are and how much we're looking and how much of the fog we've dissipated determines how much light we see. But our lack of attention or the fog has no effect on the light. It only affects our capacity to see it or hear it if we're thinking as we are today in music. And what also happens is time confuses the message. So that even now, many people are devoted to Jesus, and I've read a number of thrilling stories of people whose theology about Christianity does not match my theology, but whose experience of Jesus far transcends my own experiences in my own terms, because theology doesn't matter. What matters is that wordless yearning of the heart. But nonetheless, many people come into, when I used to teach the beginning meditation class, many people come into the class with an aversion toward God. But when I discuss it with them and we examine that aversion, it's not an aversion toward God in any absolute sense. It's an aversion toward the understanding of God that has been presented to them. Because in English it's a word without meaning. And it's given meaning by religionists and theologists and philosophers and so on. And many people, with good cause, reject those concepts. And they feel that they have rejected God. But the true definition of God is Satchidananda, ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new bliss. It's love, it's compassion, it's mercy, it's kindness. We may doubt its existence, but everyone longs for it. So we can love God and still be an atheist because all we're talking about is words. We're not talking about the wordless yearning of the heart. So when this prayer of love goes up from earth, and we say it directly, and you responded. We don't say he responded, we say you responded, because it's our prayer. And it comes down in human form, and what it does, it rearticulates and it revitalizes. So that those of us who have been lost in the confusion of dilution and verbiage and institutionalism and misunderstanding and corrupt priesthoods or whatever it might be, can actually hear the note, because the note may have been obscured. I mean, people can hear Jesus' note perfectly well in all institutions and circumstances because the fog does not diminish the light. It just makes it harder for us to perceive it. So the masters come because they have to renew it for the sake of everyone, and they have to renew it for the sake of civilization. This is what Jesus said to Babaji. The lights on the high altar of my church are growing dim, though still lit on lower altars of good works. The noble taper of inner communion with the Lord burns low and is ill attended. So they're still understanding love one another, and you will recognize me by loving one another. That which ye do to the least of them, you do for me. That may be understood. But the noble taper of inner communion, because everything emanates from our vibration. And even good works without a corresponding vibration of attunement. That's the operating system. The operating system is attunement. And even though you might think you can do it, that's really what you have to have. You have to be operating from attunement, and that requires inner communion. So whenever one of these masters is born, it's like this extraordinary wave goes across all of civilization, because nothing else that happens on our planet actually really matters. Last night when we were, celebrating is an interesting word, isn't celebrating the crucifixion of Jesus, when we were commemorating, when we were re-experiencing, when we were focusing with gratitude and awe on that moment, I was just thinking how hard it is to remember how trivial each incarnation is compared to the overall divine flow. Because we're so involved and identified with it in the moment, it's just so hard to appreciate what it really looks like from a different perspective. And so what really matters in the course of history is not all these exciting adventures that come and go. And people starve, and people are moved out of their homes, and people are killed in wars, and all sorts of things happen. And people live quiet lives of desperation or quiet lives of seeming great fulfillment, whatever it might be. But all of them are just a few threads on this huge tapestry, and the only place it's all going is to infinity. So the only thing that really matters is how and what pushes us toward infinity. Which is to say, it makes no difference what happens to us in life. The only thing that matters is what we become. And that, what we become is a hard-fought struggle. I've had to speak a number of times recently about the actual nature of spiritual community, because people will come and they think of us as some kind of a tribe where we're sort of all for one and one for all. And instead you meet this crowd of strong-willed eccentrics, all of whom are intensely determined in their own ways. And we bump up against each other. Far from it just being a feast of everybody loves me and I love everyone, it can be a little more challenging than that. And people think that community is broken when that begins to happen. But no, I've had to use the phrase many times, the friendships you see at Ananda are hard-won. And they're hard-won not because of animosity, although sometimes, as Master said, hate is as much of a draw as love. And if you love someone very intensely and then they disappoint you, then that love can easily turn to anger, and then anger to resentment, and then somebody who's been very close to you suddenly becomes your enemy. Your enemies are usually people you care about very intensely. And over the course of many lifetimes, you can see how that gets to be such a mess until we reach now, when everybody is only thinking about God, and that's that. But hard won because unconditional love is not for sissies. and to really be able to have that kind of compassion, mercy, and kindness for each other has to begin with having that kind of compassion, mercy, and kindness for ourselves. And so there we go. So Jesus says, wherever he says that, he has that line, he coaxed them with kindness to turn back again. Forsake, he said, the fulfillments of earth, for the comfort they give you lasts hardly an hour. I mean, there's so many parts in that, but the most meaningful part of that, he coaxed them with kindness. Our image of a master, even we projected upon Sri Yukteswar especially, is this extremely stern, always forcing us in some way and fighting against us and cracking our resistance and so on. It's very interesting. You think of Sri Yukteswar as being that austere, but one of the stories in the autobiography that's so telling is when the disciple that Sri Yukteswar was, from Yogananda's point of view, unreasonably attracted to, his name was Kumar, I believe, whom his charms were lost on everyone else, but Sri Yukteswar liked him or favored him. But Kumar wanted to go back to visit his village, and Sri Yukteswar knew that it would not be spiritually beneficial for him to do that. In fact, it would be spiritually disastrous for him. But Kumar chose to ignore Sri Yukteswar's gentle hints. Now think about that. Kumar went back to his village and there acquired a number of habits that made him unsuitable for ashram life. Master is very delicate in how he expresses this, and no longer was there a stately devotee, but merely a coarse peasant. And Sri Yukteswar realized that he couldn't be saved. And Sri Yukteswar was heartbroken about this, and he told Yogananda, you have to tell him to leave, I can't bring myself to do it. And Master also talks about the unfathomable nature of a master's heart. It's just there's so many nuances to this. But Sri Yukteswar knew it would be a spiritual catastrophe for Kumar, but all he did was hint. And when Kumar didn't pick up those hints, he allowed Kumar to discard his lifetime, waste his lifetime. Because if a master overpowers your free will, which is what we think we want, but we don't really, because as soon as somebody really launches a frontal assault on our ego, almost everyone acts defensively. Very few people are really happy to hear that, And if a master were to overpower our willpower, all that happens is our own actual point of view just goes underground and comes out later. Freedom has to be received willingly by the disciple. It has to be a wordless prayer for redemption from our own hearts that welcomes that. So when the master comes, which is how this starts, there's just such a celebration because our prayer has been answered, and now this sound of freedom is going to just ring out through creation. And for those of us fortunate enough either to incarnate near or with such a master, or to incarnate at a time when two or more are gathered together, and there he is in the midst of us, which is what we have now. We're so fortunate. I can't tell you how many times a day, how many millions of times in this incarnation I say to myself over and over again, and I say it without it's not egoic, it's incredulous. We must have done so much good in our incarnations to have this much good karma. This is what Master said to Norman once when Norman was lamenting because he tended to be depressive. I must not have very good karma, sir. And Master said to him, you have very, 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 when Swami wrote it, the letters got bigger and bigger and italic bold, so you could see it. Very, very good karma, even to want to know God. So even to know how much it mattered that Jesus was born. And when we sing this, sing out with joy, sing from the mountains, sing from the valleys, I read those lyrics thinking that there's some profound meaning in them. All it just says is joy, joy, joy. He's here, joy, joy, joy. Look, he's here. And that's all it says. But it says it with every cell of your being because it's our liberation. And we're talking about Jesus being born, but Jesus being here means Jesus is here, and Jesus is here in the heart and the spiritual eye, because that's where he's born. He walked through that land, and a lot of people didn't even see him. So first Jesus comes, and then there's a time of sadhana, which is Jesus comes are the obvious songs, sing out with joy it ends with, but a time for spiritual practice. And so we go into the desert solitude. Because what this oratorio does for us, it tells us how to be Christians. And it isn't just a question of sing out with joy. I saw a woman just in a coffee shop, and she was reading the Bible, and you could tell from all her little tabs in the Bible that she read the Bible all the time. And she was wearing a tank top, and you could see a tattoo that she had that went all the way across her back that said, redeemed. And I thought to myself, what an experience that woman must have had, to find Jesus, to give her life to Jesus. And she looked like she'd come up a little harder than some people might have come up. But, I didn't falter even slightly. I just thought, what an experience you must have had. And then want to just tattoo it on your back, so that you never forget. I thought, I don't know if I would have the nerve to do that. Really, seriously. But our way of doing it, you see, also includes sadhana. And this is why those missing years of the life of Jesus, when he went to India to study at the feet of the masters, it's such a great disservice to an understanding of actually how to be a disciple of Jesus. Because without that part of it, Jesus lives, you love him, he's crucified, he saved you. And there's a whole big section of there missing. Swami Master's autobiography is all about his sadhana, his tremendous longing for his master, his finding his guru, his years in his master's hermitage, the hours of meditation. And God knows, literally, he didn't need any of that. But he came into the prison and he had to show us how to get out. And we have to get out by that method. So after Jesus is born comes the time for spiritual practice and desert solitude. And to Jordan, and that's, John renounces all, left his home. And I love that part. Let me find where it's here. Where he says, till wisdom did fill the pain of his heart. Those the right way? The ache of his heart. But you also, every time I read those lines, I also think, but, John the Baptist was a great saint. But he had to, long years he spent in the desert until that longing was satisfied. And every time I read that, I think about that part in the festival. From a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to accept limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of mankind. Because they actually do come into the prison. They actually do experience the confinement, and then they break free of it. And that, John renounces all, left his home. Long years he spoke only with God until the ache of his heart. Your human griefs, our human griefs, your love alone can mend. That comes later on. But these are the poignancies of the spiritual path that this music brings out. Swamiji said, if you listen carefully, he said, all of his music is a little bit sad, all of Swami's music. But it's the sadness of the door of my heart open wide, I keep for thee, wilt thou come, wilt thou come. Sometimes people who first come to Ananda, because so many of the songs are filled with longing, they don't like it. They don't want to have to realize that. But the other side of it is, till wisdom did fill our grief, our human griefs, your love alone can mend. That's from the festival, actually, not from the songs. So then we do sadhana, and sadhana ends with Jesus being baptized and the Lord speaking, this is my son, walk where he leads. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? Jesus met his disciples and said, follow me. And Dr. Lewis, Master, said to him, you must always, the word escapes me exactly, but you have to always be loyal, you always have to love me, you always have to follow me. And Dr. Lewis said, I easily agreed, little knowing what I was actually promising. Walk where he leads. Jesus walked right into the fire and didn't hesitate. That's where he leads. He walks in with perfect faith, knowing that what God gives me will lead me to him. Why then would I hesitate? That was Swami saying once, why are you taking this so hard? Oh, let me list the reasons. Let me count the ways why I'm taking this so hard. The list is long and I can make it in duplicate for you. But his response was, why? If it comes from God and is leading you to freedom, why would you resist? So this is, and then the temptation of Christ, which is really fun when you read it because you really understand sort of what's happening. He has all this power. Now he can use it in so many ways if he'll just take it back and use it for himself. And this is how Satan tempts us. You have so much fame, you have money. If I just had money, if I just had position. You listen to so many people who've been questing after fame, especially in the entertainment industry, where people are not always known for being deep thinkers. And their thought is that now that they're celebrities, they need to use it for a cause. And their fame becomes a mean for advocating for this cause or that cause. I mean, there's no reason not to do that. You might as well. But for Jesus, it's a temptation. Take it back and use it now. Use it for whatever you want to use it for. And then Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan. My Father is the only power there is. I have nothing. This is what Swami Kriyananda would say over and over again. All you have to do, he wouldn't say I just put my attention at the spiritual I, and I asked Master to give it to me, and I knew that I couldn't do it, but Master could do it, and if it was needed, people would thought he was being glib. He wasn't being glib, he was just saying that which I do, ye shall do in greater things. And this is how it's done. It just has nothing to do with you. Swami Kriyananda said once, I loved this, toward the end of his life. He says, the older I get, he said, the more I feel the myth of Swami Kriyananda swirling around me. He said, and inside, I'm just the same old guy. That's how he put it. He never saw himself as essentially different. He behaved in ways that seem beyond us to do, but he never saw himself that way. He never took it back. It was always God's power, and that was that. He tells us a most interesting story, which we don't, Swami, that we don't usually think about clearly. When he was still a disciple, when he was still living with Master, and Master died before Swami was 25, so this was very early. Swami said he had this meditation where he felt such revulsion for ego that he just ordered the ego out. And he said then afterwards Master saw him and patted him on the head and said, very good. And Swami just states very casually, and since then I've never been bothered by it. He says once, when in the early years of Ananda, he was walking through one of the areas and he saw the lights in some of the trailers, which is all we had flickering. And he thought, this used to be just forest, and now all this is here, and I did this. And then he said, oh, but that felt so terrible. The thought that I had done it. He said that I just pushed the thought out of my mind and I never thought of it again. And imagine, not discipline. It wasn't discipline. It was just perception. Why would I take it back? So Satan tries to tempt him, but he can't. But once that is fully established, then the ministry begins. His mission begins. Jesus went to Galilee and gathered round his chosen few. In their youth, in their joy, all they asked was freedom to love. Think about the long list of prayers that we offer. Imagine, all they asked was the freedom to love. And that's what Jesus is offering us. And what could ever take that away from us? Except our own longing and regret. But the more we tune into this power, the more free we'll be. So let's try this part of it now. Okay? During the break, I was asked a question that occurs to everyone sooner or later. If in fact Master was Jesus, if in fact the three wise men were Babaji, Lahiri, and Sri Yukteswar, if John the Baptist was Jesus' guru, then how do we work all that out? Who was who in the whole story? Which questions have been asked of Swamiji, and I believe it was that question which prompted the famous shrugging of his shoulders and saying that some mysteries have to be left until we're in the astral world or Divine Mother reveals them to us. But he said things like, for example, Sri Yukteswar could have been in two bodies at the same time. Did the three wise men actually come in physical form, or did they visit him in astral spirit? He just raised lots of possibilities, none of which could be answered, none of which he could answer. When I also asked him, the story of Jesus was confusing enough, why do we have to have this reality which is how Master explained it, that Jesus' guru had given away all his spirituality to Jesus and was born in this lifetime, or incarnated in this lifetime with less than his disciple had. None of it which makes any sense. I said, Swami, the story's so confusing, why do we have to have that little twist thrown into it? Again, it was the cosmic sort of shrug, which is not everything can be sorted out with the mind. But when the question occurs to you, that is the answer, okay? Insofar as it is an answer. I feel very comfortable not being able to resolve everything, because I've also learned that the answers that I get so sure of a few years later just sort of fall to pieces anyway. So it doesn't really matter. I know what to do when I get up in the morning, and that's the most important issue. And the rest of it will sort itself out on a need-to-know basis, I figure. The Corrie ten Boom, that wonderful Christian lady from Amsterdam who grew up with in such a loving Christian family, when she asked her father big questions that were too big for her, he would say, when we go to the big city on the train, he said, when do I give you your ticket? She said, just before we get on the train. So he says, just before you get on the train, God will answer those questions for you. But you don't need to be holding the ticket until you're ready to get on the train. Which, of course, is a faith-based answer. It has to start from a premise of trusting God. But if one does trust God, one can say, I'm just not able to answer everything. It's a a bit of arrogance if you think about it, that you think the little mind that we demand of God that He answer all these questions when we haven't really done our homework yet. And we haven't done the part that's required. I mean, to understand God's perspective on certain things, we have to be closer to His consciousness. To even understand why a master does what he does, we have to be a lot closer to his consciousness. And, questions like that, answers like that, which sound like a kind of putting a person off, are not really true, because we can look. Swamiji always, when he had to give a big answer to a question, he always tried to bring it down to a piece of our lives that we could already understand and see how the principle already applied. And then you can see how the principle could apply in a situation far beyond where we are, because we see how it's already worked. And it certainly has been true in my experience that things that I thought were unanswerable, that I couldn't comprehend, when I shifted enough myself, all of a sudden I could understand what was going on, whereas I simply couldn't before, no matter how many people told me or how hard I tried. Part of this is we never believe anything until our own experience matches it. The whole of the spiritual path is not really acquiring, it's realization, which is a very interesting word. Realization is the perception of something that was always there, but we just didn't realize it. Oh, I didn't realize it. I didn't realize that you were really my friend. I didn't realize that I had this ability. I didn't realize that that was what I really wanted. I didn't realize that he wasn't who I thought he was. I mean, all of those, you say those things to say it was not, the light was not different. There was just a fog over it and I couldn't see it. So we may have all these opinions about many things, but then we realize step by step, until we realize the self, until we realize the infinite. And then when we have self-realization, we see that the whole thing was completely different than we ever thought it was. And that's where humility comes from. Humility isn't an affectation or an effort. It's not a discipline or a right attitude, although it doesn't hurt to affirm. It's just a perception of what's going on. Swami's unwillingness to take to himself the talents that almost effortlessly, or that flowed through him so abundantly, not effortlessly. He was very forceful in the use of his will, but that flowed through him so abundantly. It was impossible for him to take personal credit. Master put it even farther. How can there be humility when there is no sense of self? It's beyond realizing that I'm not that important. It's realizing that I don't even exist. So who is there to take credit for it? Now, we come now into the parts, the last part of the songs. I put it into 3 parts. First is our sadhana continues. We go deeper. Blessed are they, he who clothes the fields. The Beatitudes, who really describe to us what happens if we have right attitude and how great is the blessing. And then Jesus wins us back from delusion. And this is about Mary Magdalene, 2 souls that were fallen. This is where he coaxed them with kindness to turn back again. The power of living water, he who is steeped in sin, that all of us, the concept of being steeped in sin sounds so dramatic. And it's not merely Mary Magdalene who was living an immoral life, so they say, until Jesus came and rescued her from that, which is her song, The Joy of Redemption, and the song about Mary Magdalene. She's the prime example always held up. But Jesus did not administer to those who were self-satisfied with their lives as they were. Even if you look around the Ananda communities, people come who are successful in the world, but we're not primarily a congregation or a community of people who are huge worldly successes. Because people who are really making their way in the world and getting what they want are generally not thinking of transcending it. It's just they're not interested, it's working for them. And if it works for them, a teaching that says, for just the comfort it brings you will last hardly an hour, it's not the message, and it's not the karmic moment. The karmic moment for self-realization comes when we begin to understand that on some level this isn't working. But nor do we administer to those who can't function in this world, who haven't risen to the level of energy where they can get what they want. You know, people will often say to us, after I talked about education for life, and we did that incredible ceremony here, the fire ceremony, trying to bring energy to our high school, which, by the way, seems to be working. You know, step by step, soul by soul, but the energy is moving in a good direction. A woman who had worked for years with young people who were in trouble with the law, suggested, you know, she could take our flyers around to the various juvenile facilities and so on. I said, no, actually. I mean, not that we couldn't be helpful to those people, but that's not our population. Such people are beginning, you know, they're, for the most part, and I don't mean to generalize, they're beginning to understand the workings of karmic law, divine law, the balance between selfish desire, selfish action, and results. I mean, as a rule, people who can't even function in this society are trying to get into that flow of energy. They're also not willing to transcend it. It's Shudras becoming Vaishyas, and Vaishyas have to move all the way to Kshatriyas before we can begin to help. First, you have to have the energy to be selfish. Then you have to be selfish for long enough to realize that that's not the answer, that I really need to be altruistic. And then ultimately, even from altruism, because a great many people are altruistic, but they're still trying to fix the world, and then you have to get to the point where you realize that I have to transcend this whole plane of existence altogether. I was speaking this morning to a friend about many years ago when Findhorn community was really beginning, and Peter Caddy, who was the founder, was still living. And they were getting remarkable attention because of a marvelous book that was written about them and because all the phenomenal things they were doing with the Nature Davis and so on. It was very impressive. Findhorn still continues to be a very dynamic force for good in the world. But at this particular point, early 80s, very early 80s, Peter Caddy came to visit Ananda, and I knew him there, and he and Swami were peers and friends. And then there was a communities conference in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, or somewhere up in Oregon, it wasn't Portland. And Peter Caddy was there, and I went representing Ananda. And Findhorn, of course, was the darling of the communities movement then, and there were a lot of other presentations given. Almost everyone else present hoped someday to start a community. There were literally presentations where people showed slides of the land they hoped to buy, and after they bought it, they hoped that people would come and they could start a community. And there was very little interest in me or Ananda. And I'm not exactly a boring speaker, so it wasn't like I didn't have anything to say, and I had these beautiful slideshows and all this experience. I couldn't get anybody to listen to me at all. And I said to Peter, because, like everybody wants to hear what you have to say, and you know what Ananda is, nobody wants to hear from us. And Peter said, he was a very plain-spoken man. He said, Asha, Findhorn promises heaven on earth. Ananda tells people they have to transcend earth to get to heaven. He said, no one is interested. I said, yes, sir, that's exactly the truth. But it's a reality. And that's what Jesus came to say. I mean, Jesus lived through the worst that the world had to offer. I mean, how many people want to walk where he leads? Which is into all of that. You have to have an understanding of what the Gita says. What is day to the worldly man is night to the yogi. What's night to the worldly man is day to the yogi. It's this weird black and white shift that when it makes sense to you, it makes perfect sense to you. But there's this part, even after we come onto the path, there's this part that always hopes it's going to be a little different. That for me it'll be different. I can make it work on both sides. People are always trying to make it work on both sides. And it's a very, very subtle thing. And it's not something you can push with your mind. It's like a flower that blossoms in your heart and it just moves little by little. And there's a Sanskrit word for it because Sanskrit is so perfect for these things, and that word is vairagya. And vairagya is, in the word, the translation that's perfect is a disinclination for the things of this world. It's not even an aversion, because often an aversion is just the disciplined effort not to be attracted. You know, we hate it, we loathe it, we despise it in all these ways. But if we're giving it that much energy, it's usually because there is an opposite side that we're trying to purge, which it doesn't hurt, you know, to be firm and powerful in our affirmation. But true vairagya is just a very simple, why would I want that? And it doesn't have to be explained. You don't have to fight against it. You don't judge anybody. You're not disturbed by its presence in the world. It's not like you have to purge it from reality. It's just, I'm not inclined. I'm just not inclined. It doesn't attract me. It doesn't look attractive to me. And at the very end of his life, famously on Easter, right around Easter time, in the year Swami died, 2013, he wrote this letter, and he talked about, the hallmark of my personality has always been enthusiasm, and now I have no enthusiasm. The letter was very disturbing to people. Swami died less than a month later, so it was a signal of the end of his incarnation, which many people intuited, but they were disturbed by that. And it was a pretty blunt statement. But I talked to him, or I wrote to him, and I said, sir, what I read in there is vairagya. And I mean, what would be more perfect for any devotee, but especially someone who's 86 years old, who's accomplished everything his guru gave him to accomplish? You know, what else would you be feeling now except a disinclination for this world? You came to serve your guru, you came to help us, and there was no other reason for you to be here. Even his enthusiasm was given to him. It was given to him because it was his duty. I've smiled in that sense, and it is true. People will have, I've heard someone say, oh, Asha just loves Christmas. And I do love Christmas, and I do love Easter, but it's also, in a very impersonal sense, it's my job to love Christmas, you know? Because if I'm going to play the role that God has asked me to play, I have to be full of enthusiasm for what we're doing. Because it all, you know, it has to flow like that. It has to be a joyous, sort of endless celebration. If it were not my job to love Christmas, I don't know whether I'd love Christmas or not. I might still, but as long as it's my responsibility, then thank you, God. I'll fulfill it in the way that it's meant to be fulfilled. Swami said about himself, Swami Kriyananda, he said, I never identify with Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda is my responsibility, an event for which I am responsible. Those were his exact words. You know, imagine, my incarnation is an event for which I am responsible. If you're responsible for an event, you have to do everything you can to make it work. You can't do a schlocky job of it. That's not pleasing to God, because it's your responsibility to do it. But that's quite different than calling it yourself. You see how subtle that is? So Jesus came into this world. I was saying to a group of people earlier this week, you know, all of us have the capacity to be altruistic or self-sacrificing in ways that may look to others like some kind of suffering. But if we ourselves if it's the appropriate gesture for us, and we know by opening your house to someone or giving someone money or ceding your position to someone else, letting someone else have credit or praise or whatever might be needed, it's not a sacrifice. It's a joy to do it. You're just happy to see the result, that you're happy to be able to put your energy into something that uplifts everybody. Isn't this a delightful thing to be able to do? And other people may say, oh, you know, you're so selfless and you're like this or that. I mean, everybody knows that. You look behind you on the people who are walking the same path and you're 2 steps in front of them. You look at the people who are 4 steps in front of you and you think, how do they do that? I remember a friend of mine who used to live in her house. She always opened her house to everyone. And at that time I said, how do you do this? I just couldn't imagine it. Now I'm living in a place where my house is open to everyone. And I just there are days when I wonder how I got into this. But almost all the time, It's like, well, of course, how could I not? So I took that, and this is where I was starting, a very simple beginning, but the principle is there. So at the level that Jesus lived, at the level that a master lives, where there's no personal identification, but it's only an event and a responsibility and an enthusiasm that's given by God, there's no personal karma that compels either for or against. And Swamiji would so often speak to us, and I still struggle with this. He would so often say that happiness and suffering are really just two sides of the same coin, and they're not really that different. And I have a very, very dim sense of what he means in principle, a less dim sense than I had before, but they're just what we go through if we live in duality. We're on one side or the other side. And the reason it looms so large in our mental sky is because our mental sky is so tiny. And so we're looking at a dot like this on this huge screen. How do you feel? I said to Swamiji once when he was terribly ill. Not well, he said, but compared to an infinity of bliss, I feel fine. It just depends on how you're looking at it, like this. So Jesus knew. First, he was literally taking on the karma of his disciples. Masters do that. Swami ran so much karma for other people through his body, and so much tapasya for the work of Ananda. His body, his medical case was so interesting that doctors literally, because he was all over the world being treated by doctors, and Shanti mentioned this once, his medical record goes all over the planet. The doctors are talking to each other all over the place, just sending his medical records because he didn't make any sense, because it wasn't his karma. It was the karma of many others. And never publicly, but quietly, Swami readily and often admitted this. So there was no logic to what happened to his body, because his body, he was using it. There was no logic to Jesus being crucified. He's the Son of God. Even now, legions of angels could rescue me. You have no power over me, he said to Pilate, except that which was given to you by God. I'm not really subject to you. It's that God has put me here, and this is an event for which I am responsible. But he knew by sacrificing his body, he would work out tremendous karma for his disciples. And Master points out that after his crucifixion came the day of Pentecost, when all the disciples were lifted up into the great power of Om. They heard the sound of many rushing waters. Swami explained that because Jesus had worked out so much karma for them in sacrificing his body. Just literally. Swami said the mistake in Christian theology is to think that the sacrifice of that body is the continuing redemptive force of Jesus. Because once the body is gone, it's not like that's a retroactive and a forward active, whatever the opposite of that is, that body's sacrifice, that body was useful while Jesus was in it. But nonetheless, the Guru takes the karma of his disciples and continues to do so. And the details of the theology are less important. But Jesus says, I sacrifice my body, I allow humiliation, pain, and suffering, and death to come to me. It lasts for a little while. That's what Swami would say about the pains he would have. Well, it's been a good life. A few hours of pain is not such a big thing. We just can't imagine it. But he says it's not such a big thing. He was, he never liked to take full anesthesia, so when they had to replace his hip replacements, he did it with a spinal. And in the middle, or about 3/4 of the way through one operation, the spinal wore off, and he could feel them sewing him up. Like this is called a nightmare for most people. But he knew that if he allowed the doctors, if he told the doctors, they would have no choice at that point but to give him full anesthesia, and he didn't want it. So he just decided, life sometimes gives you a little pain, I'll just take it. So he endured all of that without flinching, without changing his breathing or his heart rate, because if he had, they would have been able to perceive it. Now, think about that. That's quite something in terms of self-control. But to him it didn't matter. Now, Jesus was facing just like that because being Jesus was an event. He didn't identify with it. He went through it. But thinking of the good he could do for others, he didn't hesitate. Now, the Festival of Light says, Greater can no love be than this, from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of others. This is the sacrifice of the great masters for the world. And the very next line is, here then is the fourth and last stage of the soul's long journey. So we've been fine having our mission as the first stage. We've been fine being rebels against that mission. We've been fine questing after truth. But the fourth and last stage is that level of complete willingness to give our lives for the sake of others. Greater love can there be, no greater love can there be than this, Jesus said, than a man be willing to lay down his life for his friends. And this is the fourth and last stage. Meaning, it's not just a question of, oh my gosh, how awesome what they've done. But this is where we're growing to. And this is what it means to walk where Jesus walked, which is to become, and let's put it in the positive, so identified with the infinite that what happens to the finite is of no consequence to us. How do you feel, Swamiji? Not well, but compared to an eternity of bliss, it's just fine. Now, we're of two minds about that, aren't we? On one hand, what a beautiful thing to aspire to. And on the other, what are we going to have to go through to get there? Like that. So what we need is we need the experience of the bliss and the courage that the great masters feel. Because holding the hand of the master, then we have nothing to fear. So, let's now go to the end of the Oratorio.